Karl Marx actually perfectly diagnosed the ideal economic structure for human society.
Wow, okay. Going right in.
I mean, seriously, if we strip away, all the Cold War historical baggage.
Right, just looking at the raw mechanics.
Exactly, the raw mechanics of his ultimate vision. He proposed a society where individuals work to their absolute maximum capacity, keep only their most basic necessities for survival, and then willingly contribute the entirety of their surplus to the collective development of others.
The ultimate equitable system.
Right. It's a frictionless machine of human progress where resource hoarding just ceases to exist. But according to the structural analysis we were looking at in this deep dive today, Marx's diagnosis was spot on regarding the destination, yet he was fundamentally missing the engine to actually drive us there.
Yeah, he essentially drafted the blueprint for this incredible vehicle, but completely failed to discover the fuel source.
Which is a pretty big problem.
It's a fatal flaw. And Marx himself, along with, later generations of Marxist theorists, notoriously ran into this exact wall.
Because they could map it out perfectly on paper, right?
Exactly. They could logically map out this egalitarian distribution of resources. They could demonstrate how capitalism's internal contradictions lead to systemic crises. But they couldn't identify the psychological incentive to make human beings actually execute this vision.
On a permanent, sustainable basis.
Right. Like, why would any individual willingly work themselves to the bone, day in and day out, maximizing their productive output, merely to give all the surplus away?
Yeah, what is the rational incentive? Because human beings have basic biological self-interest.
Exactly. What the socioeconomic philosopher Alama Parwez calls the jazba muharika, that intrinsic driving force that overrides biological hoarding for the collective good. Because historically, when states tried to force this model without that intrinsic incentive, what happened?
Well, they had to rely on extreme coercion. Secret police, gulags, the whole totalitarian nightmare.
Exactly. Which completely defeats the purpose of an organically cooperative society. The state just becomes the new hoarder of power.
Right. And that brings us to the core of the research in front of us today. According to Alama Parwez's highly structural linguistic reading of a specific ancient text, the opening 8 verses of the Quran's Surah Fusilat, that exact socioeconomic mechanism, the rational incentive structure Marx spent his life searching for, has just been sitting there all along.
But, and this is a massive caveat, we have to look at it completely differently.
Yes, to see this mechanism, we have to entirely abandon centuries of traditional, mystical, and, well, religious framing.
Which is the absolute foundation of Parwez's entire analytical framework. Because for centuries, these texts have been read almost exclusively through this lens of theology, right? Sentimental devotion, mysticism.
People turn to these verses to figure out how to perform rituals or earn divine favor.
Or achieve a private, personal, spiritual high. But Parwez decodes the original language, diving into the root mechanics of the Arabic to reveal something radically different.
Radically different.
His central thesis is that this text is not a mystical document at all. It is a highly rational, fundamentally objective blueprint for an emergent socioeconomic order.
Right, and it claims to out-theorize Marxist economics by providing that missing psychological incentive, and it does so based purely on cause and effect. Zero blind faith required.
Exactly.
But I want to challenge this premise right here because you are asking anyone listening, whether they are, a secular economist, a Marxist historian, or even a traditional religious scholar, to completely reorient their understanding of ancient texts.
Oh, it's a massive paradigm shift.
I mean, we are talking about decoding ancient language into modern structural concepts. How does a blueprint for an economic engine even get delivered in this context? Because when you or I hear ancient revelation, the immediate image is like someone sitting alone in a dark cave.
Right, falling into a trance.
Yeah, having this highly subjective, private spiritual experience. We picture something inherently unscientific.
And that traditional narrative of revelation, the term wahi in Arabic, is absolutely laden with that supernatural and mystical baggage. It's almost always depicted as an internal, personal trance state.
Highly subjective condition.
Yeah, where an individual claims to be experiencing something that no one else can verify or measure, unless, they supposedly achieve that same specific spiritual intoxication.
Right.
And Parwez is ruthlessly critical of this entire mystical framing. He argues that the mystical approach is essentially a selfish hoarding of enlightenment.
Oh, that's an interesting way to put it.
Well, think about it. If ultimate knowledge is just a private feeling of ecstasy that you experience alone in a cave, it has absolutely zero utility for organizing a functioning human society. It doesn't build aqueducts.
It doesn't distribute wheat.
Exactly. And it certainly doesn't solve income inequality.
It sounds like an exclusive country club where the only password is an unexplainable, subjective feeling. Like if you don't feel the vibe, you're locked out of the system. That is the exact opposite of a societal blueprint.
Which is exactly why Parwez bypasses the centuries of mystical commentary. He goes straight to the linguistic roots and the practical usage of the word wahi. He demonstrates that structurally, it means something entirely different from a trance.
So what does it mean in this framework?
It refers to an objective external paradigm shift. It is knowledge or structural information that comes from completely outside the human loop of trial, error, and gradual deduction.
Okay, an external intervention of information.
Right, and to really grasp how this functions, we have to look at the first descriptive mechanisms Parwez extracts from the text, specifically focusing on two words that have been subjected to perhaps the most intense misunderstanding: Rahman and Rahim.
Oh, okay. Those are terms that literally anyone who has ever brushed up against Islamic texts or even just watched a documentary in the region has heard.
Absolutely everywhere.
And they are almost universally translated as something highly sentimental. Like, we always hear the gracious and the merciful or the infinitely compassionate. To a modern ear, that just sounds like an emotional appeal.
It sounds like we're asking an authority figure to take pity on us.
Exactly.
But translating those terms as mere emotional sentiments completely destroys the structural science of the text, according to Parwez's analysis. He actually highlights a fascinating historical intellectual failure here.
What failure?
Well, many traditional scholars couldn't even explain the structural difference between the two words. You'll often find commentaries suggesting that putting Rahman and Rahim together was just a rhetorical device for emphasis.
Like saying someone is tall and lanky, where lanky just reinforces the concept of tall without adding any new functional data.
Exactly. And Parwez views that as a severe underestimation of the text's precision. He traces both words back to their shared linguistic triliteral root, which is RHM. And in the Arabic language, this is the root word for the womb.
Wait, really? The womb?
Yes, the biological womb.
So we are not talking about a feeling of kindness at all. We are talking about biology. We are talking about developmental structure.
Exactly. Let's consider the biological mechanics of a womb for a moment. It is an environment of perfect, unconscious structural development.
Right.
The mother's body doesn't have to consciously calculate, how much calcium to send to the forming skeleton versus how much protein to send to the developing heart.
The nourishment just flows exactly where it is needed.
In the exact required proportions. Cells divide, nervous systems form, the heart begins to beat, all without the mother's conscious effort or the fetus's active planning. It is the ultimate flawless system of equitable nourishment and growth.
Because the surplus energy of the mother is automatically distributed to develop the new life.
Precisely. And Parwez maps this root biological meaning onto evolutionary theory to explain how the universe, and by extension human society, is supposed to develop.
Okay, so if they both share that root of equitable womb-like development, how does he functionally separate the two terms? Like, what is the structural difference between Rahim and Rahman?
So Rahim represents gradual, deductive evolution. It is the step-by-step progress where one link in the chain logically and visibly connects to the next.
Okay.
In scientific terms, you can think of this as normal, Darwinian evolution. You move from point A to point B to point C over long, grinding periods of time.
Yeah.
And in terms of human thought and societal progress, it is deductive reasoning.
So we build a foundation, observe a problem, test a hypothesis, fail, adjust, and gradually build up to a new conclusion.
Exactly. It is the slow, grinding machinery of human intellect.
It's the trial and error of history, the slow, steady march of progress where every new invention or social policy is just a slight modification of the one that came before it.
That is the Rahim process. But if you look at the evolutionary record, and if you look at human history, the gradual chain of A to B to C does not explain every single phenomenon. Science actually recognizes a concept called emergent evolution.
Emergent evolution, okay.
Yeah, there are sudden radical leaps where a system jumps to an entirely new level of complexity that cannot be adequately explained merely by the preceding steps. This sudden macromutation, this abrupt, unpredicted paradigm shift. This is what the word Rahman represents structurally.
Oh, wow. So Rahman is the emergent leap.
Right. It is a leap in development that human trial and error had not yet reached, and perhaps could not reach on its own timeline.
Let me put this in the context of technological history to see if the analogy holds up.
Go for it.
So the Ha-Meem process is like a gradual software update. You release version 1.0, you find some bugs, people complain, so a few months later you release version 1.1 and eventually 1.2. It's a slow, reactionary improvement.
A to B to C.
Exactly. But the Raman process would be the sudden, unpredictable invention of the internet itself. It's an emergent technological leap that completely rewrites the fundamental rules of human communication and commerce overnight.
Yes.
It isn't just a faster telegraph. It is a total structural paradigm shift that resets the board.
That analogy captures the mechanics perfectly. And Parwez applies this directly to the concept of the blueprint presented in the text. The text is making a very specific epistemological claim here.
Which is?
It asserts that its socioeconomic model is Raman. It is an emergent, objective leap in societal organization that the human intellect, which was currently stuck in its gradual deductive trial and error phase, simply had not reached.
Okay, so it's not the product of human philosophy slowly grinding away at the problem of inequality.
Right. It is an external intervention presenting a finished, flawless socioeconomic system. However, once that emergent lead is introduced to the world, it has to be implemented, absorbed, and taught to society gradually, step by step.
Which is where the Ha-Meem process takes over.
Exactly.
Man, the architecture of that concept is staggering.
Yeah.
You get the internet dropped into your lap, the emergent leap, but you still have to put on your boots, dig up the streets, and lay the fiber optic cables city by city, gradually bringing the human race online.
Yes, you have to build the infrastructure. And to ensure that the gradual implementation doesn't corrupt the emergent blueprint, the text describes its own structure, using another highly specific term, fusilat.
Fusilat, a word that usually just gets glossed over in translations as detailed, which always felt incredibly generic to me.
Extremely generic. And Parwez dedicates a major portion of his critique to that generic translation. He points out a historical phenomenon where various sects and legal schools tried to prove the text was detailed by attempting to extract microscopic managerial rules out of it.
Like what kind of rules?
Like going looking for instructions on exactly how many times a day to perform a physical ritual, what specific clothes to wear, or exactly how to fold their hands during a prayer.
Okay. Micromanaging daily life.
Right. And when they couldn't find those tiny details in the text, they panicked. They either tied themselves in logical knots trying to force the text to say things it clearly didn't, or they abandoned the text entirely and relied on outside, centuries-later traditions to fill in the gaps.
So what does fusilat actually mean structurally?
Parwez explains that the linguistic root, the letters FSL, does not mean giving exhaustive micromanaging details. It means to systematically separate, distinctively categorize, and clearly delineate.
So it is more akin to separating the joints in a biological body, making sure the femur is distinct from the pelvis so that the articulation is perfect and there is no functional confusion.
That is the exact structural intent. It means the overarching laws, the fundamental non-negotiable principles of this socioeconomic blueprint are clearly separated and categorized to eliminate ambiguity.
That makes total sense. Think about the most robust constitutions in human history. They do not micromanage daily life.
No, they don't.
They establish absolute, clearly distinct structural principles, like the separation of powers. The text is declaring itself functionally executable because its foundational concepts don't bleed into one another to create loopholes. It gives you the clear boundaries of the system and leaves the micromanagement to the evolving human intellect.
Exactly. And this redefinition changes the entire posture of the text. Which brings us to a moment that I think everyone listening will recognize, even if they only have a passing familiarity with the history. The command Ikra.
Famously translated as read.
Right. And we all know the traditional narrative. An external entity, an angel, comes to the prophet in a cave, hands him a physical piece of paper or a scroll, and commands him to read. And the prophet replies that he is unlettered. He cannot read.
And Parwez completely dismantles the logic of that event, doesn't he?
He finds that traditional narrative not only illogical, but actually diminishing to the sheer intellectual weight of the event. From a purely rational standpoint, why would an advanced external intelligence bring a written piece of paper to someone historically known to be unlettered and demand they pass a sudden literacy test?
Yeah, it makes no structural sense.
None. Parwez examines the root of Ikra at its historical usage in the language. It does not fundamentally mean read this physical text in front of you. It means to proclaim, to broadcast, to announce with unyielding authority.
Wow. So the inciting incident of this entire movement wasn't a localized miracle or a test of reading comprehension. It's a command to take this emergent socioeconomic blueprint, this Raman, and broadcast it to the world. It is the proclamation of a new global order.
It completely eradicates the mystical cave-dwelling imagery. The recipient of this blueprint is not positioned as a meditating mystic seeking personal nirvana. He is positioned as a revolutionary announcer of a new paradigm.
A completely different posture.
Yes, the command is to stand up, leave the isolation, and broadcast this structural leap to a society that is desperately cannibalizing itself through economic exploitation.
And this forces us to confront a massive, glaring question about human behavior.
Right.
If we accept Parwez's premise for a moment that this blueprint is flawlessly logical, that it is an emergent evolutionary leap, perfectly categorizing how to organize a human society without exploitation or poverty, why do societies reject it?
That is the million-dollar question.
Let's ground this for you, the listener. If I come to your house and hand you the blueprints to a machine that produces limitless, free, clean energy for your neighborhood, you don't look at it and say, "No thanks, I prefer paying exorbitant utility bills and breathing smog." You build the machine.
Of course you do.
So why does humanity, when presented with the mechanics of an equitable system, violently reject it?
This is where Parwez shifts from linguistic analysis to a profound critique of human biases and established power structures. He uses a concept directly from the text called the hijab master.
Which translates roughly to the hidden veil.
Hidden veil, yes. And Parwez is very careful to clarify that this is not a mystical or physical barrier.
Okay, so no divine blindfolds.
Right. No divine entity is placing a literal blindfold over anyone's eyes to prevent them from seeing the truth. The hijab master is an entirely human, psychological, and structural barrier. It is the prejudiced, vested self-interest that blinds individuals to an equitable system.
Ah, vested self-interest.
Think about the sociology of power. When you approach a system of total equity, a system where surplus must be distributed to the collective, but you currently hold a position of privilege, hoarded wealth, or systemic power in the existing unequal system, what happens?
Your psychological defense mechanisms immediately build a wall.
Exactly.
Because fully understanding and accepting the truth of the equitable system means you have to willingly surrender your hoarded advantage. It is cognitive dissonance weaponized by class interest.
Yes. And the text itself actually addresses a fascinating historical argument that highlights this perfectly. The opponents of this new socioeconomic order argued, we don't understand this text because it's not in our specific dialect or the phrasing is too foreign.
Like blaming the medium.
Right. And Parwez notes how the text structurally shoots down this excuse by isolating the variable. The text responds, essentially. If we had delivered this blueprint in a foreign, non-Arabic language, you would have complained that you couldn't understand the words. But a S in your language, Arabic, clear as day, and you still claim you can't comprehend it.
Oh, that's brilliant. The text isolates the linguistic variable to prove that the language is not the obstacle.
Exactly. The problem is the posture of the listener. The resistance isn't intellectual.
It's economic.
It is entirely governed by vested self-interest. They reject the system because to comprehend it and accept its validity would require them to dismantle their own empires. Parwez actually quotes classical poetry to illustrate this psychological phenomenon, how intense emotional attachments or deeply vested financial interests can literally scatter human vision.
Making it impossible to see the objective truth right in front of you.
Right. The hijab master is confirmation bias, cognitive dissonance, and ruthless class interest all rolled into an impenetrable psychological veil.
Let's make this tangible for the listener right now. Imagine the CEO of a massive multinational fossil fuel corporation. They are presented with a perfectly viable, cheaper, cleaner, renewable energy model that could scale globally today.
Okay, a great modern parallel.
Their eyes physically see the data. Their brain is more than capable of processing the mathematical reality of it. But the hijab master, their deeply vested interest in trillions of dollars of existing oil infrastructure, their stock options, their societal status, it creates a psychological veil.
It forces them to reject it.
Exactly. It makes them look at the math and say, this isn't realistic, the market isn't ready, I don't understand how this could possibly work at scale. They aren't necessarily consciously lying about their lack of understanding. Their vested self-interest literally prevents the comprehension from taking root in their consciousness.
That is the exact modern parallel. The cognitive dissonance is so strong, it alters their perception of reality. And Parwez takes this critique one level deeper. drilling down to the absolute root cause of this behavior. To do so, he radically redefines one of the most heavy-hitting, historically loaded words in the entire religious lexicon.
Shirk.
Okay, I want to tread carefully here because shirk is a word with immense historical baggage. Traditionally, we are taught this translates to polytheism or idolatry, right? Bowing down to multiple gods, worshiping stone statues in a temple.
And if you limit the definition to ancient statues, modern secular humans can easily let themselves off the hook. You can just say, well, I live in a modern democracy. I don't bow to stone statues, so I'm completely free of shirk.
Exactly. It becomes irrelevant to the modern economy. But Parwes analyzes the structural mechanics of the word. He argues that shirk was never fundamentally about the physical material of a statue. It is about association and the fragmentation of authority.
The fragmentation of authority. So what does that mean practically?
Sociologically and economically, shirk is the act of making your own profit motive and your own self-interest your supreme law. It is the worship of your own ego, elevating your personal gain above the collective good of humanity.
So structural idolatry has evolved. It isn't bowing to a statue of a rain god. It is looking at your offshore bank accounts, looking at your vast accumulation of capital while neighborhoods in your own city lack clean water, and saying, this wealth is mine alone. I am the ultimate authority over this capital. My desire for infinite growth is the supreme law of my existence.
That's it.
It is the ultimate capitalization of self-interest.
The idol is the self. The idol is the hoarded wealth. To commit shirk in the socioeconomic reading is to fragment the foundational unity of humanity. You declare yourself a separate, supreme entity whose individual needs and desires override the health of the whole system. Let's return to the Ha-Meem analogy, the biological womb. If the foundational premise of a rational society is absolute unity where surplus energy flows to exactly where it is needed for collective development, then carving out a piece of that system and saying, this blood, these nutrients are exclusively mine to serve my desires regardless of the rest of the body, is structural treason.
Yeah, imagine one specific organ in a developing fetus suddenly deciding it was the supreme authority and hoarding all the available blood and nutrients for itself.
Exactly. And we have a very specific medical term for that phenomenon in biology.
It is a tumor. It is cancer.
Biological shirk is cancer. It is a rogue cell that worships its own infinite growth at the fatal expense of the host body. Parwes is arguing that hypercapitalistic hoarding is sociological shirk. It is the exact same destructive mechanism, just scaled up to a macroeconomic level.
That is a terrifyingly clear analogy.
As long as individuals and corporations worship their own infinite profit motive, the hijab master will remain locked in place and the equitable blueprint will be violently rejected by those in power.
Which brings us to the most difficult part of the equation, the puzzle that broke Karl Marx. We've diagnosed the disease. Hoarding self-interest is the societal cancer. Marx's solution was to have people work at maximum capacity and willingly give all their surplus away to cure the cancer. But how do you eradicate the cancer without killing the patient's motivation to get out of bed and work? Marx threw his hands up in frustration. He couldn't find the jazba muharrika, the rational incentive. If the text is claiming to solve this, what is the alternative structure it proposes?
To understand the text's solution, Parwes first has to redefine the actual mechanism of wealth distribution. He looks at the concept of zakat.
Another heavily loaded term.
Very. Traditionally, within religious frameworks, zakat has been severely reduced to a mere 2.5% annual charity tax, usually calculated on dormant wealth.
You pay your tiny fraction, you feel spiritually cleansed, you receive a pat on the back, and you go right back to keeping 97.5% of your hoarded capital.
Exactly.
Which, let's be entirely honest, does absolutely nothing to restructure a society. A 2.5% tax doesn't build hospitals or eradicate systemic poverty. It functions as a guilt alleviation fee for the wealthy. It's a rounding error for a billionaire.
It's structural maintenance for the status quo. And Parwes argues that this fractional charity model is a devastating distortion of the text's original intent. He traces the linguistic root of zakat, which does not mean tax or charity.
What does it mean?
It means nourishment, growth, and purification through continuous development. Zakat is not a 2.5% penalty. It is the comprehensive, overarching socioeconomic system of nourishing and developing humanity with all available surplus wealth.
All surplus wealth.
All of it. Parwes points to another verse in the text where a direct question is asked, what should we give? The explicit one-word answer provided is al-afu.
Al-af.
In Arabic, alafu means the surplus, specifically, everything that remains beyond your basic necessities.
Because the text is demanding the exact same economic mechanism that Marx demanded. Keep only what you strictly need to function and pump the entirety of your surplus back into the system to develop others.
Yes, the exact same mechanism.
But we are still staring down Marx's insurmountable hurdle. Why? Why would you or I or anyone listening as a rational, calculating actor ever agree to do this?
And here is the missing engine. Here is the jazba muharrika that Marx could not find because of his strict materialism. The incentive structure rests entirely on two radically redefined concepts. Akhirat, which translates to the continuity of life, and the nafs, which is the human self or consciousness.
Okay, stop right there.
I knew you were going to push back.
I am going to push back because this is where the secular economist or the Marxist is going to hit the brakes hard. You are asking a materialist to accept the metaphysical survival of consciousness to make an economic engine work. Isn't that just replacing the blind faith of the mystic with a new kind of blind faith? How does Parwes defend this structurally without falling back into theology?
It is a critical pushback. And Parwes addresses it by framing the nafs not as a theological mystery, but as a rational axiom.
A rational axiom, like
Yeah.
in math.
Exactly like math. Think of it like geometry. Geometry starts with axioms like a point has no dimensions. You cannot physically prove a point has no dimensions, but you accept the axiom to see if the resulting mathematical system is coherent and functional.
Okay, I follow that.
The text offers the survival of the nafs as a structural axiom. If you accept it, the economic system that follows is flawlessly logical. Let's break down how the two economies function.
The two economies.
Right. The text requires you to view human existence as having two distinct, parallel economies running simultaneously. The first is the biological economy of the physical body. The second is the evolutionary economy of the human self, the nafs.
Okay, break those down.
The physical body is an animal organism. It is nourished, maintained, and made comfortable by what you consume and what you keep. You eat the food, you wear the clothes, you build the secure shelter. If you want your physical body to survive, you absolutely must retain physical resources.
Right, that's just basic biology.
But, and this is the inescapable biological reality, the physical body is temporary. It will inevitably die, decay, and disintegrate.
Dust to dust. The biological economy, no matter how much wealth you hoard, always ends in total bankruptcy for the individual.
Yes, and Marx only believed in the biological economy. He is a pure materialist. He did not believe in any continuity of consciousness beyond the physical lifespan.
So for Marx, if physical life is all there is,
Exactly. If you ask a human being to give away all the resources they have spent their limited biological energy to acquire, you are asking them to act directly against their only rational self-interest.
that makes total sense. If physical life is all there is, hoarding resources to ensure maximum comfort and security before you die is the most rational, logical thing a biological organism can do.
It's the only logical move.
The implication of that is staggering. If the game permanently ends when my brain activity stops, whoever dies with the most hoarded capital wins. Or at least live the most comfortably insulated life. Marx's entire economic system required human beings to act like perfectly altruistic angels while simultaneously telling them they were nothing more than biological animals.
It is a fatal, unresolvable paradox.
Wow.
It is the paradox that destroyed his vision in practice. But the blueprint Parwes is analyzing introduces the second economy, the evolutionary economy of the human nafs.
So the consciousness.
The nafs is your consciousness, your core identity, the you that observes the world. The text posits as its core axiom that this nafs does not disintegrate with the physical body. It has the potential for akhirat, the continuity of life, which is the next stage of evolutionary existence.
So we aren't talking about playing harps on clouds in a mystical heaven. We are talking about the evolutionary survival of consciousness beyond the biological stage.
Yes, but here is the mechanism, the absolute stroke of structural genius in the text. The physical body is nourished by what you keep, but the human nafs is only nourished, developed, and evolved by what you give away for the development of others.
Wait, really? It reverses it.
Completely reverses it.
That entirely flips the concept of the human profit motive. You aren't losing wealth. You aren't making a sacrifice. You are executing a currency conversion. You are transferring temporary physical capital into permanent evolutionary capital.
Exactly. Look at it through the lens of pure, calculated self-interest. If you hoard your surplus, your physical body might be incredibly comfortable, secure, and pampered. But your nafs, your actual enduring self, is starving, shrinking, and completely failing to develop.
Because the designated currency of the nafs is the act of contributing to the collective.
Right. Therefore, contributing your surplus isn't some arbitrary good deed. It isn't a sentimental act of charity to make you feel warm inside. It is a strict, undeniable, rational requirement for the evolutionary survival of your own self.
So the incentive for this equitable society isn't altruism at all. It is ultimate long-term self-preservation. It is the most hyper-rational self-interest possible.
Yes.
Think about this if you're listening right now. Every time you transfer your surplus wealth into a dormant savings account, you are overfeeding the biological economy that will eventually die,
Yeah.
and you are actively starving the evolutionary economy that survives.
You're starving yourself.
I am not giving you my surplus because I pity you. I'm giving you my surplus because it is literally the only mechanism by which I can invest in my own evolutionary continuity.
Parwes argues that this is the only psychological framework wherein a rational human being will consistently, over a lifetime, work at maximum capacity to produce a surplus, and then willingly give it all away.
Not through state coercion.
Not through the threat of a gulag and not through mystical guilt or fear of hellfire, but through a calculated scientific understanding that this is the mechanics of building their own nafs.
That is incredible.
And when a society adopts this, the text promises that the system yields a Ger-Mamnoon result.
Okay, let's define Ger-Mamnoon, because it sounds like another one of those terms that gets terribly mistranslated.
It traditionally gets translated as a reward without end, which just sounds like a magical infinite payout from a deity.
Like a cosmic slot machine.
Right. But Parwes analyzes the structural root. It means an unbroken, continuous chain of logical consequences. It means that when you invest your surplus in the development of humanity, the evolutionary return on that investment for your nafs is continuous and never arbitrarily cut off.
So it is not a divine favor or a handout?
No, it is the fundamental law of cause and effect operating in the evolutionary economy. If you follow the blueprint, the system works continuously without friction.
The architecture here is simply stunning when you step back and look at the whole picture. I mean, if we zoom out and look at the engine of this rationally governed society as laid out in Surah verses 1 through 8, it is a complete closed-loop machine.
Every single part relies on the other.
Let's trace the journey of these 8 verses to see the structural integrity of Parwes's analysis.
Sure. So it begins with a claim of an external objective paradigm shift, an emergent evolutionary leap, the Raman, delivered as a flawless, unambiguously categorized blueprint, which is the Fusilat.
And it commands the recipient to broadcast this new order, the Ikra, rather than hiding it away in a mystical cave for a select few.
It then immediately diagnoses the primary psychological obstacle that will fight this system. The hijab master, the veil of vested self-interest that blinds the privileged classes.
To overcome this, it demands the complete and utter dismantling of shirk, which we now understand is not about smashing archaic stone statues, but about smashing the structural idolatry of personal hoarding and the supremacy of the individual ego over the collective.
And once you smash that structural cancer of hoarding, you implement the positive alternative, the Trizakad, a comprehensive societal-level system where all surplus labor and wealth, the alafor, is pumped back into the society to nourish everyone, just like the biological womb.
Finally, it powers this massive, equitable machinery with the ultimate rational fuel. The firm conviction in Akara, the continuity of life and the mechanics of the nafs, the absolute calculated certainty that the only way to ensure your own evolutionary survival is to give your surplus away.
It is breathtaking because when viewed through this structural lens, it requires absolutely no blind faith.
No mystical trances.
No sentimental appeals.
Yeah.
It operates entirely on the cold, hard logic of cause and effect. It tells us that if a society operates on the friction of hoarding, class division, and hyper-individualism, it will stagnate, cannibalize itself, and eventually collapse.
Its own biological economy will consume it.
Exactly. But if a society operates on the continuous, frictionless nourishment of the collective, it evolves. It achieves that Ger-Mamnoon, an unbroken chain of human progress.
It provides the missing engine that defeated Karl Marx. It offers the rational incentive required to build a truly equitable world without coercion. It tells the human being, work hard, take only what you need to sustain yourself, and willingly give the rest away, because that surplus is the only currency your true self can spend in the next stage of evolution.
That's the engine.
Which leaves you, listening to this deep dive right now, with a sharp, lingering question drawn directly from Parwez's structural analysis. If the true evolution of the self only happens through what we give away to develop others, is our modern, hyper-capitalist world just a society of comfortably overfed bodies and dangerously starved selves? Think about that next time you check your balance.